event, and we have Chris Tomlinson with us today to talk about his book, his amazing book, Tomlinson Hill. I read the whole thing, I could not put it down, and I think part of what interests me so much is that I too am a fifth generation Texan, and I brought Chris. I'm going to board Chris later today with my family scrapbook that I put together, and one of the things that I now want to figure out is whether my ancestors also slaveholders. I don't know that, and Chris did know that, and he knew that from a young age. And so I wanted to start the conversation. Well, first let me introduce Chris. He grew up in Dallas, and fifth generation Texan, but he spent, right now he's working for the Houston Chronicle as a columnist, but he spent 9 years in Africa, Central Africa and East Africa, as an AP correspondent and bureau chief. He covered 9 war zones. And then came back to Austin in 2007. And he spent 5 years working on this book. This book has also been made into a film, and there's an interactive part where they're collecting oral histories. And it tells the story of race relations in America through a small community and in Central Texas, and 2 Tomlinson families, one black, one white. From the introduction, I was just riveted. I just couldn't believe how, well, this is how he starts his introduction. He says, it was my childhood fantasy of living out Dr. King's dream to have sons of slaves and the sons of slaveholders meet in brotherhood. Now, I want you to tell us a little bit about that kid who thought that. I mean, you were grade school age when you were thinking this. And so, that's quite a statement for a white grade school kid in Dallas in the 70s. And so tell us about this idea you have and kind of the sparks of this book to begin with.
Well, I guess I should start out by saying that there was a tension in my family about this. My grandfather would say to me, our family owned slaves, and they loved us so much they took Tomlinson as their name. Now, my father was off in a corner cringing because he suspected, as I later found out, that love was not the reason they took the Tomlinson name. In fact, most slave families took the names of their masters out of a form of coercion and as a method of continued control for the next 20 years. But this also was happening as a little kid. I was watching the riots in Boston as busing was taking place. I knew that from what was happening around me in Dallas, that there was desegregation and busing coming to my neighborhood. In fact, I was among the first children bused when Judge Barefoot Sanders, you can't beat a name like that, declared that he'd had enough, it was enough. 20 years of stalling by the Dallas Independent School District was too long, and that he was going to bus kids across town, and that's what it took to end segregation in Dallas. So there I was in the 4th grade in an all-white school in the Richardson Independent School District that my family had conveniently put me in, even though technically I lived in DISD. And then they said, hey, you got to go. You can't go to this school anymore. You've got to go to the Dallas school. And by the way, your Dallas school is going to be integrated. It's going to be the first year we've ever done this for 4th graders. So there I am in 4th grade, and I went from an all-white school to a good 50-50. And the black kids were being bused up from South Dallas. They were spending 45 minutes on the bus. So they're tired and cranky. And the teacher in the front of the room decides that she's going to do something to help solve this problem. And her first solution was to call a little black boy up and say, have you ever touched a white person's skin before? Have you ever touched their hair? And it was like, it's okay to touch each other's hair and touch each other's skin. And it was all very awkward. I, at the age of 8, or 9, understood that this was just a little weird. And then she played a recording of King's speech. And when I heard those words, it clicked for me. My family owned slaves, and there were black Tomlinsons out there somewhere. I had no idea where they were. I had no idea where Tomlinson Hill was. But there were little black kids named Tomlinson, and they were the sons of slaves, and I was the son of a slaveholder, and this was the defining issue of the United States at that time. And so, yeah, that's, it may sound incredible that a 9-year-old would reach this conclusion, but within the context of all that was going on around me, it was hard to miss.
And then you found some scrapbooks. Was that later?
No, it was, actually it was a little earlier that I found the scrapbooks. Because my grandfather died, and we were cleaning out my grandfather's house. And to give you an idea of the tension, my grandfather was a very conservative Dallasite. He had been the chief civil engineer on Highland Park Village, for any of you who've ever shopped there. He was a wealthy man, developed houses, but as my father says, he was an all-purpose bigot. He hated everybody. He was not Anglo, Northern European, and Protestant. My father was adopted, and he chose to rebel in every way possible. And so they generally didn't get along. But when my grandfather passed, I was going through this big house, and my grandmother had these scrapbooks laid out to be packed away. And I just started thumbing through them. And that's where I learned about Tomlinson Hill. Didn't know where it was, didn't know where Falls County is. It's about an hour and 15 minutes up by 35 from here, just before you get to Waco. And and what I was fascinated about was the great uncle who'd been a Texas Ranger. Because if nothing appeals to a 9-year-old more than a Texas Ranger, right? So I was really excited about that. The rest of it about slaveholding and this cotton plantation, I wasn't so clear on.
So the book traces 5 generations, black and white, through Texas history, and there are a lot of themes in the book. And one of the things that you talked about in your intro was that you wanted to know the truth, and you said that one thing that all forms of justice shares, they need to establish the truth about what happened. And until the truth is known, there can be no reconciliation. And Chris spent a lot of time in the 90s in Africa, and he met Nelson Mandela. You were greatly influenced by Desmond Tutu. And so it was your quest to kind of come to your own personal reconciliation. And so can you talk about kind of the quest for the truth? So, as said, I reported from 9 wars in Africa and Asia, including Iraq and Afghanistan, Middle East, Lebanon, Israel. And I also saw a lot of attempts at peacemaking, particularly the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and the Gacaca trials in Rwanda. I covered the end of the genocide in Rwanda, and I lived in Rwanda for the first 2 years of the reconstruction, in which we still had 300 people a week were being killed when I was in Rwanda.
And that's where I learned, it's not about, we're a very puritanical country. We're really all about the punishment, right? I mean, we take the individual and we've got to punish that individual in some way. They've got to pay personally. We've got to deny them their freedom. We've got to take away their money or their status in society. But most justice systems don't work that way. Most justice systems are tied up in, first of all, let's just tell the truth. And then let's compensate the victim, and then let's move on. That's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was about. If you went and confessed your crimes in front of the commission, whether black or white, and believe me, the ANC did their share of crimes, you were given your freedom. You were given your immunity. As long as you told the truth and you weren't caught out in a lie. And the Gacaca court system was pretty much the same way. You might have to do community service, but you didn't go back to prison. And I realized that, we'd had the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we'd had the 13th Amendment of 1867, we supposedly had solved all of our problems with race in America, but we'd never really faced up to what really happened. In fact, we kind of want to say, well, Jim Crow, well, that's all over. We fix that. As soon as we pass that law in 1965, it's solved. But we don't talk about what happened. We don't talk about the lynching. We don't talk about these horrible things. And one of the things that I had learned growing up in desegregated schools in Dallas in the 70s was that we were not equal. That I had a lot of privileges that my black friends did not have. So that kind of did. So I was thinking, well, maybe I need to explore that. And as an investigative reporter, I'm a pretty unpleasant person anyway. So I'm not afraid to ask hard questions and dig into people's past and look at their mistakes and call them out on it. I mean, that's what I do for a living. It's a lot of fun, by the way. You don't have a lot of friends, but it's a lot of fun. And so I thought, well, I've been running around the world pointing out other people's problems, other people's crimes, other people's injustice, but I've never looked at mine. Why is it that of all my friends in high school, the only ones that went to college and got professional jobs were my white friends? It didn't happen for my black friends. And we went to the same school, the same classes. Why didn't it happen? So that was kind of the... And frankly, I was also really annoyed at the conservative line that there was no more racism in this country. That there was no more discrimination. But what really, really made me angry was this idea that the past doesn't count for anything. What's happened in the past doesn't matter anymore. So I thought, so let me examine that. And how can I show that the past does count? That it has meaning and it has resonance? So I followed two families.
Well, I have never felt like I understood where we are better than from reading your book. How we got where we are. And if y'all haven't read the book, I highly recommend it. You did a huge amount of research for this book. And you have, in particular, I was astounded, you have a letter from 1853. And I just was curious if you tell us a little bit about your research process. We know it took you 5 years. Did you work on it exclusively? But how did you get a letter from 1853?
So I didn't work on it exclusively. Books don't pay that well. I'd say probably for half the time I was working part-time. I had a part-time job and I was working part-time on the book. And then I got a job offer I couldn't turn down, and so I started working full-time at a day job, and then worked basically part-time on the book. My wife still hasn't forgiven me for the fact that we didn't take a vacation for 3 years. So I spent all my vacation days and all my weekends working on the book. I'm not one of these writers. I can't go write 8 hours in my day job and then go home and write for another 3 or 4. I get 8 hours is about all the writing I have in me. And so the weekends and my vacation was really the only time I had to spend on the book. And so I dedicated that time. I got lucky, and that's the first key that any author will tell you when they're doing research is they'll remember the really lucky things that came about. There was a family in Marlin. It was the founding family, really.
Let me just interject, Marlin's the closest town.
Marlin is the closest town to Tomlinson Hill in Falls County. And it's basically, the family's last name is kind of changed a little bit, but it's one group of people. And a guy named Posh Oldthorpe used to be a regent at the University of Texas in the 60s. Collected all the letters of his family, from his family, and published a book called The Marlin Compound. And it was about everyone connected to his family and all the letters and diary entries that he had found. And it just so happened that several of my relatives are related by marriage to the Oldthorpe clan. And so they were in the book. They were in this book that was published in 1968. Best I can tell, Posh used his powers of regent to force the University of Texas Press to publish it. All the letters are, all copies of all the letters are kept at the Briscoe Center. And so I can go back and verify those things. I was also, fortunate that the Marlin had a newspaper from about 1880 forward called the Marlin Democrat. And it was weekly, and sometimes it was a daily, and then it's a weekly now, but it's been around since, for 130 years, 136 years. And so I read 136 years of newspapers. And it was so rewarding because you got an idea of what life was really like in this small town during those periods. What was particularly exciting was that the founder and editor until 1943 was an old Irishman named Jim Kennedy. And like me and all of investigative journalists everywhere, he got a really big kick out of exposing the truth. So when there was this rash of lynching, he was an anti-lynching crusader. And we're talking, there was a lynching once a month for a while in Falls County. And there were like 4 or 5 lynchings across the state every week. But whenever there was one in Falls County, he went off and he did a detailed investigation into who was lynched, why, who likely did it, and half the time he proved that the white man who died was innocent. Now, needless to say, this made him very unpopular in the community. Newspaper editors from surrounding towns would write editorials condemning him and his work. But he stuck with it. And by the 1910s, when the whole sentiment against lynching turned and people realized what a horrendous crime it was, they elected a mayor. And then they sent him to be the state rep in Austin. And then he retired, and then the Klan came along. And so then he goes on this anti-Klan campaign for 10 years. Risks his personal fortune, risks the newspaper, and he pays the son of the Jewish shopkeeper in town to go sit up in a high point and write down the names of everyone going into the secret Klan meeting, and then runs their names in the newspaper. So yeah, Jim Kennedy, J.M. Kennedy, he's one of my heroes.
Well, but what you have done for us, and sorry if I keep gushing on and on, but what you have done is you've read all those newspapers. you've been to the Briscoe Center, and what you've done is distill it into a narrative that we can read and follow. So thank you for that amazing amount of work so that we can follow along, especially for those of us who've lived in Texas a long time and have deep roots, or who are interested in civil rights, which a lot of people in this room are. It's an exceptional education. So the book spans the Civil War, Reconstruction. So I thought maybe you might tell us what about the Texans in this story. What's the Civil War? Gives a little tell us a little bit about the Civil War with our characters here, who are real people. That it reads almost like a novel to me.
Well, I mean, I'm a nonfiction writer, and so I'm committed to the idea that true stories are stranger than fiction, and they can be fun. My agent and I went round and round on how to structure this book, and we just decided that there were too many people with the same name to do it in anything but a chronological narrative. The problem with that is that before 1930, I'm relying on documents. And then I found some very old people to help me to tell me the stories that happened after 1930. So when you read the book, I feel like there are two books there. There's this history, and then there's this much livelier section where I've got more human voices in it. And that was probably the biggest struggle in the writing, to kind of create that narrative structure. And the fact that we opened the book with the very first Tomlinson to arrive on Tomlinson Hill. And it was a woman, Susan Tomlinson Jones, and she was married to one of the largest slaveholders in Texas, a guy named Churchill Jones.
Oh my God.
And Churchill had bought 120,000 acres on the Brazos River, centered on the one and only waterfall on the entire 620-mile stretch of the Brazos. And soon after he bought and settled his family there, he started recruiting his relatives. And so Susan Tomlinson Jones recruited her brother, James K. Tomlinson, to move from Alabama. They all lived together in Alabama. So she convinced him to move from Alabama, and then Jim Tomlinson's sister was a woman named Sarah Jemima Stallworth, and she recruited her brother to move, and they set the three plantations up right next to each other on the western side of the Brazos in Falls County, and just operated one huge pine plantation. And Tomlinson Hill was the one little rise that sat a little higher above everything else, and believe me, it's not much. But it's a little higher than everything else, and you can see Marlin from the Tomlinson homestead. So that's where it got its name. When the war came, Churchill and Jim were against secession. They were old Whigs, Whig Party guys. And they believed in the Constitution. They thought, well, Fifth Amendment says you can't take away my property without compensating me, so let him. If they want to do away with slavery, that's fine. But they better pay me every penny my slave's worth. And Washington doesn't have that kind of money, so why secede? It's a fool's errand. They were opposed to it. In fact, when Sam Houston came through town to campaign against secession, he stayed at Churchill Jones's house. And he was all bloodied up from being stoned in Waco for speaking out against secession. But when you've got 45% of your money invested in your land, the other 45% is invested in your slaves, and you only got about 5% in cash, and the rest of the state votes to secede, well, here's the truth about my ancestors. They were more worried about their money than they were about the morality. And so they went with the flow. Churchill started raising money for the Confederacy, sold them cattle, cotton, everything they needed, anything they wanted. He used to run lines of supply trains up to the troops in Arkansas. Jim's two oldest sons joined. The eldest was myopic, so he ended up in an artillery unit where he could load the cannon, because he couldn't see very far, but he could see close enough and well enough to load a cannon and fire it, as long as someone else aimed it. And then the second oldest son became a cavalryman with Tom Green's cavalry, one of the most, by all accounts, one of the most courageous cavalry units to come out of Texas. Well, it did take, things were going pretty badly, and Galveston was captured by Union troops for a while. And so the eldest son had to retreat, and then they took Galveston back, and then they got Jim Tomlinson to make him a lieutenant colonel in the state militia, and then his job was to run around the state telling slave owners that they needed to send 10% of their slaves to Galveston to help fortify the island, or else he was going to send troops to take those slaves down to Galveston. Well, unfortunately, Jim Jr.'s eyes got so bad he had to go back home. Will died at a battle in Louisiana. He was shot in the back during a retreat, and his last words were, "Please tell my family I didn't die a coward." That's in the book. That's one of the letters that was sent home to the Old Horse. And of course, Jim contracted malaria and was flat on his back when the war ended. And so the slaves actually had to carry Jim out to an oak tree on a litter so that Jim could tell his slaves that they were free. And then they carried him back inside, and he died 6 weeks later from fever. So.
Well, I think one of the more interesting characters too is after Jim dies, so he lives a widow right in the middle after emancipation. I mean, and she has to deal with the fact that she now is poor, and her husband has died, and she has to settle his estate, and
It's $1 million in debt because $1 million worth of slaves walked away.
And it's just, you really painted a picture of what it must have felt like. She had to sell crops, she had to sell some of her furniture, she borrowed money from her relatives. I had to
She sold
really
her
feel.
books. She sold 4 boxes of books, which depresses me.
Yeah, I thought she was really, the husband went off to war and kind of left her with a big mess to deal with it.
But what's interesting is several of the slave families stayed behind, including a man named Milo, who took the name Tomlinson, and his family. And so that's kind of the beginning of the Black Tomlinsons. And an exciting thing was finding Milo's marriage certificate from 1866, when he finally got to marry his wife, whom he had already had 3 kids with. And it's still sitting, the original is still sitting in the Falls County Courthouse.
So,
I'm sorry, I'm being really horrible here. I
no,
hope I'm not throwing you off.
You're being delightful, thank you. One of the things that's near and dear to my heart is public education. And so you weave both the political, what's happening in the political world, and what's happening to these characters in their lives, but also kind of the what's happening in public schools, why the legislature won't fund it, and setting up the first black school, and most whites at this time were educated privately, and so there was no concept of public school. And Charles Tomlinson said that this was probably around the 30s,
It was an African-American Tomlinson.
Yeah, that's an African-American Tomlinson. So, it goes on for years, and he says that he knew that the white society didn't really care if he got an education. And, sometimes I feel that way, that the legislature still feels that way. So I was just curious if you give us a short little description about kind of the education, schools and education of these two families. And it almost what happens in our state is happening.
So conservatives in Texas have opposed public education since at least 1856. And that hostility has never waned. And of course, after emancipation, one of the big disputes became whether or not black children should be educated, and whether they should be educated at state expense. And the sense is that, well, most people said no. What's interesting is my family did build a school and funded a school in 1868 called the Tomlinson Negro School. But the kids only went to school for 4 months out of the year, and they only went just long enough to read, write, do basic math, and then that was it. But this battle in the legislature over how much to spend on public schools, who should pay for it, what is adequate, how much should be spent on whites, how much should be spent on blacks, that question continued to be a football up until the 1960s. You know, even after Brown versus Board of Education, this was a matter of intense debate. And to give you an idea, one of my favorite parts of the book is that Charles Tomlinson, who has passed away last year, is just a couple of years older than my father. And so I compared and contrast the schools, the elementary schools that both attended in 1952. Of course, my father was attending Robert E. Lee Elementary in Dallas. It was a WPA-built stone school. Everything was brand new. He was taking German lessons in the 4th grade, along with violin lessons. There was a gymnasium, a theater. It was just, it was what we think of as a good public school. Charles, at the same time, was attending school in the shack that used to be the Tomlinson Negro School, the sharecropper shack that they had relocated after it had been flooded out twice in the 1900s. So they relocated to higher ground. Wind blew through the walls. The books were 10 years old. They only went to school 6 months out of the year because the kids were needed to pick and cut and plant cotton. And needless to say, there was just an outhouse that all the kids had to share. There was no music, there was no language programs, And of course, Charles's father says to him, well, son, all you really need to learn is how to add and subtract so that you know when the white man's ripping you off. And that is my father's generation. It's not that long ago. And to think that somehow that Charles's grandchildren are going to somehow overcome that in just 2 generations, to me, is just ludicrous.
It's ludicrous. So in the 1970s, the quality of life has declined for these black Tomlinsons. And in your film, it primarily concentrates on present-day Marlin and how the community has struggled with poverty and race today. And you talk a lot about how, they were laborers and how to go into that, how impossible it has been for them to jump into the professional realm. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about kind of what happened in the 70s, what caused that, because for a while Tomlinson Hill was a vibrant community of about 100 African Americans, They primarily were self-sufficient. They wanted to stay segregated because they, at least according to your book,
Protect themselves.
to protect themselves, because the less they had to do with whites, the less humiliation and less dependence they had. But then it shifts.
Right.
And your book really explains why we now have slums, basically.
You know, desegregation of our communities and our schools, I think from this point forward, as young scholars come along and they're willing to kind of give an objective look at this, really was a disaster for the larger African American community. If you were a doctor, a banker, an insurance salesman, if you were some sort of professional in the African American community, this was your permission to go live someplace else, someplace nicer, someplace better. And they took it. If you were a white family living in a major urban area and schools are being desegregated, this was your cue to move to the suburbs, so you're to an all-white school district, so that your kids wouldn't have to mix. And that's what happened. And it certainly is what happened in Dallas. I mean, Dallas schools were by far majority white. It was like something like 75% white in 1969. By 1979, when I was at Skyline High School, they were already 55% black. And it wasn't because of the boom in black population, it was because the whites all moved out. They moved to places where their kids didn't have to go to black schools. And that's a problem that persists today. White flight also means loss of income, loss of property tax revenue. It's all the things that go with it. In the film, and I know there's at least one, possibly two people from Marlin here tonight, and I know that I am not the most popular person in Marlin, Texas at the moment, because my film really kind of looks hard at what happened. Marlin is a microcosm for something that happened all across the South. But there was a great teacher named Anna Steele who taught at Marlin Junior High, and she taught before and after segregation. So she spent 12 years of her career teaching desegregated schools. And she talks about how it kind of destroyed the black community, because it concentrated the poverty and did nothing to help those kids get out of poverty. So the 70s are interesting because all of this is happening, but also it's probably the period in which my family and the black Tomlinsons had the most in common. Because my father dropped out of Texas A&M after one semester, and then he dropped out of SMU after one semester, and then he tried to make his living throwing bowling balls for a living, and then drilling holes in bowling balls. And so my family went from one status down to a very much lower status. Economically. And drugs came in, and this is all in the book. So drugs came in, the sexual revolution came into my family, my parents divorced, raised by a single mother after a while. All those same things happened to the black Tomlinsons at the exact same time. So really, if you were lower middle class in America, blacks and whites probably never had more in common than they did in the 70s. They struggled to deal with these issues. And of course that's reflected in the schools. My mother decided to leave Dallas when I was 15 years old. When I was at the Dallas high school, I was making straight A's. When she moved us to Colorado, she was able to find a place. She found the cheapest house in the whitest, most high-class suburb of Denver that she could afford. And in a matter of one semester, I went from being a straight A student to straight C's with a lot of D's. That's the difference in the quality of education between the two different schools. It's how I ended up in the Army when I was 17, frankly. But the standards were so different. What was being taught was so different. And we don't appreciate that. We don't quite understand that you know, the sudden desegregation of the schools probably did more harm than good. I'm not sure what else we could have done. But this idea that would somehow solve the problem it isn't quite accurate.
There's so much more I could ask you. I'm going to, we're going to open it up to the floor, but there are a couple of things in your book that we're going to talk about the Klan. We could keep continuing talking about the political climate. I mean, it's all, I always tell my daughter, everything's political. But you have this quote here that I'm quoting you. You say, bigotry is based on a human drive to divide ourselves up in order to hoard power and privilege. Science tells us that race, tribe, and clan have nothing to do with bigotry. They're inventions of society. And then you also say that the DNA research has shown that there's no such thing as race. And I just kind of wanted to let that sink in because that was something that really resonated with me. And then,
well, yeah, I mean, you know, Malcolm X wrote about this very eloquently in his autobiography when he went to Mecca for the Hajj, for the pilgrimage, Islamic pilgrimage. In America, probably until the last 20 years, we really only saw race. There were people who were white and there were people who were black. It's only in the last 20, 30 years that we're beginning to see the true variation of colors that exists, which you see if you go to Africa, if you go to the Middle East, if you go to South Asia. You see such amazing variety, and then you realize there's no such thing. And then when we look at the DNA, the scientists will tell you that me and a black man, me and LaDainian Tomlinson, who's my contemporary, the famous football player, for those of you who follow football, he's my contemporary on the black side of the family. He and I probably have more DNA in common than me and any white person in this room. And he's a very dark-skinned, tall, powerful black man who looks nothing like me. And by the way, we haven't had a DNA test because his family doesn't want one for reasons I completely understand. But I mean, the science isn't there. We trust our eyes too much. And our society has built this division that in Africa no one sees. My favorite, this is completely off topic, but it's not in the book, but when Colin Powell became Secretary of State, my boss in New York, I was in Nairobi at the time, I was the Nairobi bureau chief of the AP, he says, I want a reaction story from Africa. What do they think about the first black Secretary of State? And I go, you know, they don't see it like that here. But you know, my buddy, my boss, he lives on the Upper East Side, he knows everything, right? So he's in New York, he knows everything, so he sends me out. And it was only after I got quotes from at least 10 Kenyans saying, Colin Powell's not black, he's white. He's got nothing to do with us. You know? You're like, Obama, no, he's the son of Kenyan, but Colin Powell, no. So it's, there's just any black person in America is white. I mean, because their idea of white and black is not the same. It has nothing to do with the color of the skin. It has to do with your culture and where you come from. And that's why they call South Africa America. Because South Africa is not really Africa, it's America. It might as well be America for what it has to do with us. So, so that's, if nothing else, I want people to kind of take that away, is that this is all a construct that we inherited, and we can shake it off. And I'm just going to go on a little bit longer, and I'll stay late. make up for it. I get into the science in my last chapter, and we know exactly what part of the brain racism comes from. It comes from the amygdala, or amygdala, however you want to say it. I'm from
It's
Texas.
a doctor in the house. What do you say, Nona?
Amygdala, thank you. So the amygdala is where your fight and flight mechanism comes from. And so they put all these racists in an MRI, fMRI, functional MRI machine, and they show them photos, they flash them photos of black people, and that part of the brain just sparks like crazy, right? And they go, ah, there it is, there's the racism spark, we can see it. Then they took a bunch of soccer hooligans in England. You know, people who get into riots over whether they're Man United fans or Liverpool fans. And they started flashing photos of other white men wearing the opposite team's jersey. And the amygdala is going freaking nuts. It's sparking like crazy. Then they show them pictures of black men, and there's no response. Because it's England. They're not worried about race, but they're going to kill you if you support the wrong soccer team. Football, by the way. So then they go around and they do this experiment. They take the racist, they throw them in with a group of black men, and say, okay, you've got to do this task. You've got to build a log cabin. We're going to show you how to build a log cabin. But you've got to work together and you've got to build it. So they take 3 days and they get together and they build a log cabin and they follow the instructions. And at the end they go, oh yay, we built our log cabin. Put the racist back in the fMRI machine and suddenly that spark's gone. Because he learned to work together. He became familiar. He relearned the fight or flight mechanism. Because it's the frontal lobe that tells the amygdala what to be afraid of and what to fight. And you can reprogram that, and it's not that hard if you make the effort. And then Ladanian, when he was at University High in Waco, told me about how no one on the football team was racist. He says you train together, you bleed together, you go out there and you win and lose together. He says you don't see it. You don't experience it. There were kids, there were gangs killing each other out in the yard over race at University High School in the 1980s in Waco, Texas. Mostly Hispanics and blacks fighting each other. All the whites had left by that point. But no one on the football team saw it for the same reason. It's learned, folks, and we can unlearn it. It's not that hard.
Fine Arts does that also for kids.
Mm-hmm.
And, all right. So we're going to open up the floor for questions. We got hands up, and Sharon's going to pass the mic around.
Well, I'm sure, speaking for all of us, we're just so astonished at your empathy and identification, in addition to the research skills that you have as a journalist. I know that's all an important package, so kudos to you, Chris.
We know each other, so
yeah.
I've got to say it all.
So my question actually goes to one of the author's perspectives, and it comes from something you said early on. So early on you mentioned that your father was adopted, which means that he was given the Tomlinson name and the Tomlinson's history, and his progeny, you and others, carry on the Tomlinson name and history, which means that you are not that different from the slave family who took the name and carried on, and the football player who's your counterpart carries this environmental history, the social history of his family, but not the bloodline, in the same way that you don't have the bloodline. So I'm wondering if that slight distancing from this really painful history of your family gave you any kind of perspective as a writer. Does that come into play at all with the incredible clarity with which you could see your situation?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point. My father was adopted, but a year after he was adopted, his mother was able to conceive. And so there is so he has a sister who is a blood Tomlinson. And they grew up together 1 year apart. And I have cousins who are blood Tomlinsons. And for whatever reason, their perspective's not that different from mine. So I think there's a generational perspective. I would also, as I explain in the book, because my youth was very tumultuous, because there was a lot of anger and fighting and a lot of unhappiness in my family, I actually grabbed on to the Tomlinson identity and the Texas Rangers and the slaveholders. Because remember, in Texas, we're all of a certain age, we know that to be a slaveholding family was aristocracy. It was, I mean, I thought I was straight out of Gone with the Wind. And we all know how everyone loves Gone with the Wind. So that was where I was descended from. I had no shame in the fact that my family owned slaves when I was growing up. In fact, I used to brag about it to my little black friends. Because I'm as hard on myself in the book as I am on everyone else. So maybe because my father was so iconoclastic, I took that from him, and maybe he was able to be that iconoclastic because he felt that separation. But at the same time, I have to be honest, so much of my identity when my family life was falling apart and I was failing out of school and I was having to join the Army because not even the community college would take me. I was well on my way to becoming a criminal. So, yeah, I mean, it was my ability to take such a harsh look at the reality of it is something I think probably developed mostly as an angry reporter with a righteous sense of indignation, which we all have, that led to it. But it's a good question. It's one I keep asking myself.
Question?
Joanne's got one.
I hear hopefulness in the fact that this is
Oh,
large.
I'm extremely hopeful.
And so if there is hopefulness, what is the prescription?
So here's the good news. The good news is that the millennial generation is the least racist generation ever tested and recorded. They just don't see it. We've done a really good job of them not seeing race. That's not to say that they're not bigoted and prejudiced. It's that their kind of unique form of bigotry and prejudice is not understanding why, if race is no big deal, why aren't we all equal? They don't know their history because we don't teach the history. We've got a state board of education that wants to call it the triangle trade instead of the slave trade. We have textbooks that say workers instead of slaves. We do not teach our children that white supremacy is the foundation of America, of American society. And it hurts to say that, and we really don't want to admit it. And I understand why we don't want to admit it. I mean, after all, that little old man and that little old woman standing in front of the Victorian house in 1920, it's really hard to say that he killed people, that he murdered people. And that based on the number of mixed race kids that were on Tomlinson Hill in 1860, his father raped people. But we don't want to say that. We're not comfortable saying that. We don't teach about lynching. We don't teach about the horrors of Jim Crow. And so we have a generation that's not racist, but they don't understand the inequities in our society. And so they go, oh, well, if that person hasn't succeeded, then it's their individual fault. And so that's kind of where it breaks down. But I'm extremely hopeful. We not only, I mean, this is true in the United States, but I think I can tell you as a war correspondent, it's true in the entire world. Whatever you see on television, this is the least violent, least criminal era of human history.
Hard to believe.
Now, we have the internet, and, you know, I can literally stand on a battlefield and take a photo with my professional camera, and it can be in New York within a second and be on your internet screen about 30 seconds after that if we don't bother to write a caption. If we write a caption, it'll take 2 minutes. All right? So we can show you more horrible things happening from more corners in the world than we've ever been able to ever in human history. But I can tell you, in the 90s, when I first started as a war correspondent, was 100 times worse. It's 100 times worse. So, no, we're moving in the right direction, and we can't lose our sense of that.
What can each of us do to move it farther, faster?
Repeat that.
Vote against Mary Lou Bruner. But other than that, what can we do to move it farther,
So what
faster?
can each of us do as individuals? You can do a less involved version of what I do. You bear witness. You know, when I was a bureau chief in Nairobi, and you wanted to be a war correspondent, you got sent to my bureau. If you were brand new and green and you needed to learn how to do things, you needed to learn how to survive. And my job was to train the next generation of war correspondents. And I always taught them my mistakes. I said, this is a stupid thing, I did number 1, and then I would one by one teach them all 1,000 stupid things I had done up until that point in my career. Because by teaching them my mistakes and how I made the mistakes, why I made it, and how to avoid it, I could possibly save their lives. I've lost a dozen journalist friends in battle. I don't want to lose any more friends, though I know I will. But I worked hard to try to minimize that. Admit your mistakes. Admit your ancestors' mistakes. You know, don't love them so much, love your ancestors so much, or respect them so much that you cover up for them. And you condemn the next generation to commit the same mistakes again. So just, you know, you have young people in your lives. You know, when one of the greatest moments for me was I was at a friend's house for Thanksgiving. Their new daughter-in-law, who was a school teacher, went off on how black people are just different, and I don't understand why they are the way they are, and really, you know, they've really got to do something to help themselves because, you know, their condition is just so horrible. And this is a graduate of the University of Texas teaching elementary school kids. She read my book, and the next Thanksgiving came back and said, "I'm so sorry, and I was so stupid, and I can't believe you didn't just slap me." They're ready to learn. They just need people to teach them. And you can buy them my book.
All right, let's take
Then think about it.
You mentioned that, I believe it was in the 90s, that you felt like the white and the black had more in common.
70s.
70s, okay. I'm wondering if we're not seeing more of that now in the, whatever these are, the teens, because of the economic inequality, that maybe one of the reasons that there's not a focus so much on the racism or whatever, there's more of an acceptance of it, is because they have common cause, because they're all oppressed. You know, white people can't get jobs either. And so now it's a different way of looking at things.
Well, I would just point you to the Black Lives Movement and the number of young black people who are killed every day in America. Not just by police, but by crimes. You know, it was, it's how we prioritize. No one cared about crack until white kids started using it. Everyone's getting upset about opioids and heroin right now because white kids are dying, not just black kids anymore. The inequalities today and the desegregation today and the number of mixed race families, I mean, even in Marlin, Texas, under the age of 30, you see mixed couples all over the place. I've even had a few of the elders come to me and talk to me about that. So, yes and no. I mean, the economic inequality should be uniting people, just like it should have in the 1910s. But you know what happens? We get leaders like Donald Trump who come along and start telling people that introduce a neo-nationalism and a neo-ethnocentrism, where you can tell the poor white people, well, at least you're white. And you should vote for whites, not make common cause with people of other colors. It's the oldest trick of American politics to divide the poor, to turn against each other. I hope they don't fall victim to it this time. We'll see. But I'm not that convinced. Yes, sir.
Are you as optimistic about Texas politics?
Repeat the question, Sharon.
Am I as optimistic about Texas politics? Well, I mean, Texas politics, I'm sure, will survive. They're not going anywhere. They're going to be around forever, as long as there's a Texas. Am I optimistic about the end of Texas being a one-party state? Well, I mean, I spent years covering one-party states in Africa, and the similarities are remarkable. The corruption, the third-rate quality of politicians after a certain point.
Hypocrisy.
The hypocrisy, the propaganda, it's all very similar. Yeah, I'm a columnist now, so after 20 years I get to have an opinion, which is why I'm so free with you guys tonight. So I will tell you that I think demographics are destiny. And I suspect that when the Democratic Party takes control of Texas again, which it inevitably will, two things. It will not happen as soon as we would like. And two, the leaders of the Democratic Party will not look like any of us.
Yeah.
And it will probably make us damn uncomfortable. And that's as it should be. Anyway, sorry. One more question. We need to end on enough note.
Have you had your black and white reunion on Tomlinson Hill?
We haven't. And there are a number of reasons for that have everything to do with the complications of family and nothing to do with race. Partially because there are now two black Tomlinson families that do not get along. Because LaDainian's dad had two wives.
Almost refreshing.
And they don't like each other. So that's been the biggest barrier. That and LaDainian's trying to get on ESPN as a sportscaster. And the number one rule for a black man in sports is never talk about race. Because you don't want those white sports fans to turn on you.
Yeah,
Last question is a very
just really quick.
I grew up in Mississippi, and I'm married to the one man from Marlin, I think, in the room. And he won't ask a question, but I will. It's kind of off topic from what we've been discussing, but I haven't read your book. I'm going to, but I have seen the documentary. Loved it, and was wondering if LaDamian's mom is still. Billy's parents have both passed away, so we don't go back to Marlin like we used to. So I'm just wondering, she was starting a, kind of a
She was trying to do
crusade,
a
really
community
doing a lot
grassroots.
in Marlin. Do you know if that's still happening?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in touch with Lorianne and the Black Tomlinsons weekly. In fact, keep your eyes open for a rapper coming out of Austin named King Solo, who's just got a recording contract. His real name's Stephen Tomlinson. King Solo, K-I-N-G-S-O-L-O.
We have two Steve Tomlinsons.
Yeah, we have-
This crowd will know the other.
Yeah, no, I know Stephen Tomlinson too.
Right.
Yeah, but this is a gangster convicted felon, Black Tomlinson. He is nothing like Stephen Tomlinson, the playwright.
You sound unnaturally proud of that.
I am very proud of him. He's actually a fascinating man.
The criminal background.
It's the sad part is finding black men in America who don't have a criminal background, and that opens a whole nother
It does.
discussion that I get into slightly in the book. But Lorianne had to have 2 knee surgeries, and so she's been the last 2 years she stayed at home with her family in Fort Worth. There are also some political problems in Marlin. They're going through city managers like water, and the one that she was last working with to try to get the community garden going basically tried to extort her, but he's now gone, and so it would have been a lot better film if we'd had a happy ending with the community garden, the blacks and white Tomlinsons on Tomlinson Hill, and a barbecue, and we released doves at the end of the day. But the problem with true stories is that it's real people with real frailties and real, including myself, are imperfect. And so it didn't work out as well as we'd like. And I do know a descendant of the old horse who lives in Austin, who owns the Marlin compound, the big family estate in the middle of Marlin. He just wrote me an email 2 days ago telling me that his family's decided not to sell, and they want to know what they can do to try to rebuild Marlin. And he actually might have the money to be able to do something. So hope continues. If you've not read the book, and if you're interested, and I'm not, 2 things. One is I'm happy to sign books. 2, I have paperbacks on sale for $15 in the back. It actually, if you want to buy it now and have me sign it, I'm happy to do that. It actually does me better good if you go to Book People and buy it, because this doesn't count as a sale, but when you buy it at Book People, it does. And I want you to enjoy your evening. And I'm not here to sell books. I just want to make they're available if you really, really need to have one and you really want me to sign it now.
You really need one.
And,
For your own.
and they do have
Education.
signed copies of it.
Okay, that's,
So,
thanks.
so I guess that's it.
Okay, and I have a few announcements. We're going to try and get our own Jim George here for June with his book, and then we'll be taking a break for July and August, and then for our fall lineup, we already have Sarah Bird lined up. Yay! Dominic Smith, I don't know if any of y'all saw the article about him. He has a new historical fiction book out, and he's slated for September, and then we have H.W. Brands already lined up, and maybe a couple of little surprises in the works as well. And then Sarah Bird wanted to know, when we were all here with her somebody in the crowd had a son who was a publisher in New York. Does anybody remember who that was?
Elizabeth Crook.
Elizabeth Crook, when Elizabeth Crook was here.
I think I mentioned that Barry and Janet Young have a son who's a publisher.
Okay, it was you. All right, well, I'll get with you on that.
Not
All
my
right,
son, not my son.
Not your son, but you know somebody. Okay. And I think that's really about it. Thank you all so much for being here.